All right, today we're gonna look at part one of Rawls's extremely lengthy article, "The Law of the Peoples," which is actually based on a lengthier book, I believe, called "The Law of Peoples." Uh, so you're just getting a snippet of it. It's a long reading, and we're gonna work through it slowly, and then we're gonna look at next week at some responses to that piece, because as I don't know, maybe unexceptional or non-interesting it may appear to you students, it was an important, influential article, and it made waves in political philosophy. Okay, by the way, I forgot to put quotation marks around the phrase "the law of peoples." That's a grammatical, well, no, uh, bibliographic faux pas. So please forgive me. Um, so in this lengthy article, Rawls has some aims. Uh, First, he aims to defend a liberal idea of justice between states, similar to, but not quite the same as, uh, his justice as fairness, which we talked about in the first, or no, actually second week of class, when he talks about the veil of ignorance in the original position, which I'm not going to rehearse again for you. In this article, he's concerned with international law and justice, and he approaches it via a social contract. I guess with the stuff we read a few weeks ago, he was more concerned with kind of intra-national disputes, kind of the standards of justice between members of an individual nation or society, whereas now he's kind of interested in the relationships between societies. Um, and just as the principles decided on behind the veil of ignorance in the original position it was basically kind of a contractarian or a social contractarian approach. Well, he's going to use this similar approach uh, for his Law of Peoples. His second aim is to explore the question of toleration between states, specifically the toleration of non-liberal societies by liberal societies. Now recall that when I say liberal, I don't mean Democrat. At least not Democrat as the political party in the United States. Uh, that's contrasted with the Republican Party. There's a sense in which Republicans and Democrats would both count as liberals in Rawls' schema, which is a point I've made many other times throughout this course that I just want to stress it again. But yeah, he's interesting. Like, democratic states. What are the limits of toleration of democratic states on non-democratic states? Well, I'll put some flesh on this. So mainly, what are the limits of toleration again? So, for example, should we not tolerate? We shouldn't tolerate an abusive regime like North Korea, for example. But we do business with other regimes that certainly don't share our same political philosophy and don't share the same view, don't have the same views of rights that we have, like Saudi Arabia, for example. Uh, what limits should liberal society tolerate non-liberal societies in? So this is obviously a real-world pressing question that politicians face on a daily basis. Um, so we're going to get into that. He starts off talking, kind of explaining his social contract approach to, getting this law of peoples. So here's an issue. Rawls is defending a moral theory about international law that derives its authority and has its origin in a social contract. Yet, this is a theory that is going to be universal in scope. By universal, it means it will apply to all rational beings, or all human beings, for example. So, he mentions that it's easy to explain the universality of older moral theories, such as ones offered by Locke and Leibniz. Those are two Enlightenment philosophers. These theories, which were universal in authority and formulation, they got they're universal in authority because they got their authority from God. So if a being like God, handed down a moral theory to you, that would be fairly universal. They are universal in formulation as well, so again, they apply to all rational beings. Other philosophical views, such as utilitarianism, also they get their universality from first principles. Like, remember the first principle of utilitarianism: maximize pleasure, minimize pain, or something like that. Well, that is kind of where these theories get their universality, and their authority is human reason in this case. And these theories would be like mathematics. These moral first principles would be like mathematical truths. That is, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true for all rational beings. That's, it's a universal truth. Okay, so both the divine source views and the rationalist views get their universality then from, well, their source of authority, human reason or God. So, but Rawls is defending a constructivist view of international justice. How on earth could that be universal in scope? Well, before we address that, let's look at just a definition of a constructivist moral theory. So we'll quote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And they say that it's constructivism in ethics is a view that insofar as there are normative truths, for example, truths about what we ought to do, they are in some sense determined by an idealized process of rational deliberation, choice, or agreement. So constructivist views then don't begin from universal first principles, unlike, say, utilitarianism. So, for example, justice as fairness, Rawls' theory, the principles do not, in justice as fairness, Rawls' theory, the principles don't apply to all subjects. Instead, they are constructed in a way in which rational parties adopt principles of justice for each kind of subject as it arises. So let's take an example of how constructivism works, according to John Rawls. First, take a series of subjects, such as political justice for a closed and self-contained democratic society, then work forward to principles for the claims of future generations, outward to principles for the law of peoples, and inward to principles for, well, social questions. Once you've moved pretty much in those 4 directions, according to Rawls, the doctrine will be universal in its reach when the doctrine is extended to all politically relevant subjects. So, where is the authority of constructivist moral and where is the authority in constructivist moral and political doctrines? Well, its authority rests, according to Rawls, on the principles and conceptions of practical reason, but always on these as suitably adjusted to apply to different subjects as they arise in sequence, and always assuming as well that these principles are endorsed on due reflection by the reasonable agents to whom the corresponding principles apply. Alright, so this leads to 3 questions. First, note there is a distinction between 2 parts of justice as fairness. There's what applies to the domestic institutions of democratic societies and what applies to collections of societies, basically political relations between peoples. So, think of the first level, or the first part is justice between members of the United States, and then the second level is justice between the United States and other societies, like Canada. Okay, so you got to distinguish those 2 parts, pretty obvious. Rawls' thesis is that liberal and hierarchical societies, then, can agree on the same law of peoples. And remember, the law of peoples is between societies. Okay, so that's his thesis. Let's see how he defends it. Second question, why start with well-ordered liberal states as opposed to the world as a whole as it is? So the world is not this. It's not this. Remember the distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory? Well, this is a non-ideal world, but Rawls is kind of starting out in the ideal world. Why? Rawls has a response. He says, well, go ahead and try it in the world as it is. I'm going to start here instead. Well, partially because it's simpler. And then my brief aside is I think that Rawls' hunch is, I think, that the convictions of justice in those not part of well-ordered liberal societies are roughly the same as those in liberal societies. But that's an aside. Okay, third, note that there is a distinction between, I'm opening a piece of candy, that's that squeaking noise you hear. Third, there is a distinction between the law of the peoples and the law of nations, or international law. International law is basically the existing legal order, which is subject to rational reflection, and you would hope it maps onto the law of peoples. So just think of the law, international law, or the law of nations as legal, and the law of peoples as moral. And when I say that legal-moral distinction, where you hope what's legal maps onto what's moral, well, think of it that way. Okay, so liberal ideas of justice contain 3 elements. First, they have a list of certain basic rights and liberties and opportunities. Second, They have a high priority for the fundamental freedoms in 1, and 2, 3, they have measures assuring for all citizens adequate all-purpose means to make effective use of their freedoms. Now I'm talking about this extension to liberal societies, and it's going to take place in 2 stages. And the first stage is the ideal world, or strict compliance, where people just in fact do abide by the law of peoples. And in that first stage, we'll have 2 steps. 1 pertaining to liberal societies, step 2 to hierarchical societies. The second stage deals with non-ideal theory, the real world as it is with all its messy wars. And that starts with what's called non-compliance theory. We'll explain that. And 2, unfavorable conditions. Okay, let's take a look at the first stage. Well, actually, before we do this, some more background information. Yeah, let's take a look at the first stage. If it'll let me. There we go. Okay, good. So, the first stage implies that states and peoples, in fact, strictly comply with the principles agreed to, and that favorable conditions for liberal and hierarchical institutions are obtained. In other words, it's the non-real world. Duh, it's the ideal world. In stage 1, there are only two kinds of well-ordered societies: liberal and what Rawls calls hierarchical. So this is a kind of a social contract between liberal and hierarchical societies. It starts with liberal societies and then it'll extend to hierarchical societies. Stage 2 is the non-ideal theory. By the way, this lecture we're going to look at stage 1. The next lecture we'll look at stage 2. But it's worth saying a few things about stage 2 real quick. So stage 2 is non-ideal theory. This real crazy world we live in with dictators, scarcity, nuclear weapons, and riots. And it's also a 2-step process. Step 1 deals with non-compliance. So non-compliance theory is the predicament of just societies, liberal and hierarchical, as they have to basically deal with and confront states that don't comply with the reasonable law of peoples, that don't comply with it, that refuse to cooperate. Step 2 deals with unfavorable conditions. This has less to do with problematic people, like dictators, and just problematic situations, like famine. So this is how poorer and less technologically advanced societies can attain historical and social conditions that allow them to establish just and workable institutions. So in a real world, non-ideal theory, I know, is going to be of more practical importance, but Rawls wants to start with ideal. And I think it's ultimately going to be plausible for why he does that. Physicists look at frictionless planes, even though they probably don't exist, but it helps them with a lot of other features of their various theories, and it's got applications for like modern day engineering and so on. This is kind of like what we're doing in ethics. Okay, so let's talk about the extension. What Rawls then does is he takes the original position with its veil of ignorance and uses it in an extension. So what you have again is representatives who aren't representatives of various groups of citizens within a society. Instead, they represent whole societies. So it's the same veil of ignorance. It's like the original position, only it's representatives of societies instead of representatives of citizens within societies. Should make sense. But the representatives are once again subject to the abstractions of the veil of ignorance, such as the size of their territory, their resources, their location. And then after this occurs, Rawls thinks that the representatives would agree on the following principles of justice. So it's the same story: veil of ignorance, original position, and then what do they agree on behind it? This time the list is 7 principles. 1. Peoples, as organized by their governments, are free and independent, and their freedom and independence is to be respected by other peoples. 2. Peoples are equal and parties to their own agreements. 3. Peoples have the right of self-defense, but no right to war. 4. Peoples are to observe a duty of non-intervention. 5. Peoples are to observe treaties and undertakings. 6. Peoples are to observe certain specified restrictions on the conduct of war, soon to be in self-defense. And then 7. Peoples are to honor human rights. I'll spend less time explaining these during this lecture, but those is what we would agree on. Some caveats first, though. Principle 4 obviously doesn't apply in the world-disordered, non-ideal world. The non-intervention constraint. So this is an ideal world scenario. So if there's like a genocide going on, most people would say we should intervene and prevent the genocide. For example, a lot of people wanted us to intervene in Darfur. There's also, this list is open to revision according to Rawls. There's also an interesting implication that Rawls notes, and I quote, unless a definite agent is given a responsibility for maintaining an asset and bears the loss for not doing so, that asset tends to deteriorate. In this case, the asset is the people's territory and its capacity to sustain them in perpetuity. The agent is the people themselves. As politically organized, they must recognize that they cannot make up for their irresponsibility in caring for their land and conserving their natural resources by conquest in war or by migrating into other people's territory without their consent. Okay. Rawls gives some empirical support for the law of peoples, especially in stage one between liberal societies. So he says the historical record suggests that, at least so far as the principle against war is concerned, this condition of stability would be satisfied in a society of just democratic peoples. Although democratic societies have been as often involved in war as non-democratic societies since 1800, firmly established liberal societies have not gone to war with one another. So think about that. Democratic societies tend to not go to war with each other. This is, of course, could be changed, but does the historical record's in Rawls's favor in this case. That's why it's humorous. The movie South Park, United States goes to war against Canada. In fact, there's the movie Canadian Bacon, which is the same premise. It keeps coming up in cinema because it's so unlikely to actually happen because the two societies are so similar, and they're by Rawls's lights, liberal, well-ordered societies. Okay. Step 2 is Rawls' extension of the law of peoples to well-ordered hierarchical societies. Here he purports to show that representatives of hierarchical societies would also adopt the same law of peoples as liberal societies. Here again, he's going to have 3 requirements for a hierarchical society to be well-ordered. What are they? First, the hierarchical regime must be peaceful and gain its legitimate aims through diplomacy and trade. The society is not expansionist. It respects the civic order of other societies. So it's peaceful. Its relationships with other societies is peaceful, basically. It's inter-societal relations. Second, the system of law in a hierarchical society is sincerely believed to be guided by a common good conception of justice that takes into account people's essential interests and imposes moral duties and obligations on all members of society. So you can have a hierarchical, well-ordered society that's non-democratic, but people kind of accept the hierarchy and the arrangement because they have an agreed-upon account of the good, basically. An example of a non-political society would be like the church, the Catholic Church. We have a definite hierarchy, but people are okay with that generally because they have a common conception of the good. Okay. Additionally, there's a reasonable consultation hierarchy that allows for different voices to be heard, but not in a democratic way, albeit. So members don't have the right to free speech per se, but they have the right to express political dissent at some point in their political process, like in a courtroom. You can give objections to the judge. I put that picture of Kim Jong-un on there because he's obviously not a representative of a well-ordered hierarchical society. He's not one that's willing to listen to objections. Don't assume that Rawls would take that, North Korea, to be an example of a well-ordered hierarchical society, because it's not. Okay. Third, the hierarchical society respects basic human rights. So the conception of justice includes persons having minimal rights to subsistence and security, freedom from slavery, serfdom, forced occupations. They have personal property. They have formal equalities expressed by rules and justice. Here's a real quick aside. There's a difference between private and personal property. You can have no private property in your system, but have personal property. So a car would be private property, but your toothbrush would be personal property. Even if you don't believe in private property, you don't want other people using your toothbrush. So that would be personal property. So that is all it takes for a well-ordered hierarchical society according to Rawls. Another important point. Meeting these three requirements does not, for Rawls, entail that the society is a liberal democratic society. So the question is, how then can liberal societies be in agreement of the law of the peoples with hierarchical societies? Well, Rawls gives two considerations in favor of cooperation. First, the representatives of the hierarchical societies are rational, and second, the representatives of the hierarchical societies do not extend their religious philosophical doctrines to other people via war and aggression. So they're not aggressive and they're rational, they're not squirrels. There's a third consideration, perhaps. Rawls writes, and I quote, "A people sincerely affirming a non-liberal conception of justice may still think their society should be treated equally in a just law of peoples, even though its members accept basic inequalities among themselves. Though a society lacks basic equality, it is not unreasonable for that society to insist on equality in making claims against other societies." So here's an inference that Rawls denies. So this conditional, this if-then statement is going to be blocked by Rawls. Non-equality within a society, so non-equality with other societies. He thinks that you can reject that. I think that would be a place to challenge Rawls, by the way. If you disagree with Rawls, here's one point of weakness. I think he needs to defend why he denies that. Okay. Rawls, further, let's talk about human rights. He argues that liberal and well-ordered hierarchical societies will agree on minimal basic human rights. So even a monarchy where you think you have this like royal class that are, more special, more privileged just by blood than others, you can still have a basic conception of human rights. Human rights understood as minimum standards of well-ordered political institutions for all peoples who belong as members in good standing to a just political society. Basic rights like the right to life, security, personal property, rule of law, and so on, etc. And they would play three roles. One, human rights would be a necessary condition of a regime's legitimacy and of the decency of its legal order. Two, by being in place, they are also sufficient to exclude justified and forceful interventions by other peoples, say by economic sanctions or in grave cases by military force. And then three, they set a limit on pluralism among peoples. Okay. Next lecture, we will look at non-ideal theory. That'll be Rawls' Law of the Peoples, Part 2.